My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old. I've spent the past decade building my career, climbing the corporate ladder in a company that, at first, seemed like the dream job. I've always been someone who works hard, maybe too hard at times. I've sacrificed a lot in the pursuit of success. But in the end, it all fell apart. And now? Well, I'm trying to piece it back together. But first, I need to tell you how it all started. So bear with me as I go back to the beginning. I had always been the kind of person who believed in hard work. My father taught me that if you want something, you need to work for it. No shortcuts, no excuses. It was a lesson I took to heart from the moment I entered the corporate world. I started at a small firm right out of college, and I knew my path wouldn't be easy, but I was prepared. I knew I had to fight, prove my worth, and climb higher than anyone expected. The company I worked for now, the one that had promised me the world when I first signed on, was known for its relentless pace and cutthroat environment. It wasn't just about getting the job done, it was about outdoing everyone around you. And for the most part, I loved it. The pressure kept me sharp, the competition kept me on my toes. But it was exhausting. I would arrive at the office before the sun even thought about rising, and I'd leave long after it had set. I'd often skip lunch, using the time to catch up on emails or draft reports. My colleagues were the same, rushing to meet deadlines, scrambling for that next promotion. It was a game, a constant race to stay ahead. And the stakes? High. Every time we got a new project, it felt like a test. I knew I had to be the one to stand out, to prove that I deserved to move up. No matter what it took, I would get that promotion. I was closing in on it. I could feel it. The signs were there. My manager had given me more responsibility. I was trusted to handle bigger projects, clients, and more crucial decisions. I knew it wouldn't be long before the next promotion opened up, and I would be the one they chose. But I was also tired, more tired than I had ever been. There were days when my body felt like it had no more energy to give, when my mind screamed for a break. But I couldn't afford to stop. The dream was too close now. The moment I took my foot off the pedal, someone else would grab my place. I had to push through. It wasn't just the long hours, though. There was also the constant worry that my work might not be enough. It's funny how the higher you climb, the more vulnerable you become. At first, I was just a small part of a team, but now, my every decision was scrutinized. One wrong move, one missed detail, and I'd be out. The company didn't care about me. It didn't care about any of us. It cared about results, profits, clients, and growth. And I had convinced myself I was fine with that. I was playing the game. The price was worth it, or so I thought. I don't think I even realized how badly I had been pushing myself until the first symptoms hit. It started with a headache, a small throb, nothing too serious, but it lingered. Days turned into weeks, and it never went away. Soon after, I began feeling dizzy, and my energy levels plummeted. Still, I ignored it. I had a meeting with the CEO in a few days, and I couldn't afford to miss that. I pushed through it. I didn't have time for sickness. Not now. Not when I was this close. But then it got worse. My body was screaming for help, but I didn't listen. I couldn't. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much. A few days of discomfort wouldn't stop me. I kept going until one day it all came crashing down. It happened during a presentation to a potential client. I felt my vision blur, my breath become shallow. My hands shook as I clicked through my slides, trying to keep my voice steady. The meeting ended in a blur. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my boss's office, her eyes filled with concern. I barely registered what she said, only that she wasn't happy. "We've been noticing some performance issues, Sarah," she told me. "We're going to have to let you go." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My brain couldn't process it. How could this happen? I had given everything to this company, everything. I tried to explain, tried to tell her that I had been ill, that I needed just a little time to recover, but she didn't care. "We can't afford to wait for you to get better," she said. Performance is everything. This is a business. I stood there, numb, as she handed me my severance package and showed me the door. It felt surreal, like I was floating above myself, watching the whole thing unfold. I had worked myself to the bone for years, sacrificed friendships, time with family, my own health, and this was how they repaid me, with a cold, heartless dismissal. I couldn't believe it. The company I had given my life to had just discarded me without a second thought. There was no apology, no concern, no humanity, just a reminder that performance was all that mattered. And the moment I stopped performing, I was out. As I walked out of the building, a feeling of emptiness began to settle in my chest. I had always been the one to power through, the one who wouldn't let anything get in the way of success. But now I had nothing. No job, no future with this company, nothing but a bruised ego and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I felt powerless, broken. But that wasn't going to be the end of my story. No, this was just the beginning. At first, it was easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of ambition. Everyone around me seemed to be running on high-octane energy. The competitive atmosphere was palpable, and it fueled me. I found myself pushing harder, staying later, and constantly looking for ways to prove that I was worthy of a seat at the table. I quickly learned the unspoken rules of the company. Your worth was measured not just by what you delivered, but by how much you were willing to sacrifice. Personal time? Forget it. Weekends? Not a chance. Sleep? Only when absolutely necessary. I remember my first big project, the one I was sure would set me apart from my colleagues. It was a marketing campaign for a high-profile client, and it was the kind of job that could make or break a career. I poured every ounce of my energy into it. I researched for hours, brainstormed ideas in the middle of the night, and even started missing dinners with friends and family. It didn't matter, the project had to be perfect. When the presentation day arrived, I was nervous, but I pushed it down. I had done everything I could to ensure that nothing went wrong. My manager, Evelyn, was known for her sharp eye and even sharper words. If she didn't like your work, she made sure you knew it. But that day, she smiled. "Well done, Sarah," she said. "This is exactly what we need." It felt like a victory. I was on track. I had done it. But little did I know, that was just the beginning of a far more treacherous road. As the weeks passed, I started to notice the subtle shifts, the tiny things that no one talked about openly, but were impossible to ignore. Evelyn was pushing me harder than ever, and I was beginning to feel the strain. The late nights started to blur into early mornings. I was losing touch with everything outside of work. My friends stopped calling, and I barely spoke to my family anymore. I didn't even notice how much weight I was losing or how often I felt dizzy. There was a constant pressure to outdo myself, to show I was capable of handling more, of being better. And so I did. I took on bigger projects, more clients, more responsibility, but each time it took more from me. Every win felt hollow because there was always another mountain to climb. It wasn't just the long hours or the stress, it was the way it all became a game of survival. One day, Evelyn called me into her office and asked if I was ready to take on a new, major project. I could already feel the weight of it before she even mentioned the details. The deadline was tight, the stakes were high, and the client was notoriously difficult to please. But I said yes, of course. I couldn't afford not to. I spent days, then weeks, focusing on nothing but that project. I barely noticed the fatigue creeping in, the headaches that were becoming more frequent, the growing sense that I was no longer myself, that I was becoming a version of someone who lived solely to perform and please others. I knew something was wrong when I started missing small details, a report here and there that wasn't up to my usual standard, a miscommunication with a client. It was only a matter of time before Evelyn noticed. And she did. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," she said one morning, her voice colder than usual. "I've been reviewing your recent work and I'm concerned. There's a pattern of mistakes here. You're not hitting the mark. You're slipping." It felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I was tired, that I had been pushing myself too hard, that I was trying my best. but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I just nodded. Maybe you need to step back for a while, she suggested, her tone laced with indifference. You're clearly not in the right headspace right now. I knew what that meant. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how much I had given to this company, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. That afternoon, I left the office feeling drained and hollow. My body ached from the tension, but it was my heart that hurt the most. I had given everything, my time, my health, my energy, and it still wasn't enough. That night, I finally admitted to myself what I had been avoiding for months. I was falling apart. The exhaustion was catching up to me. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I couldn't afford to fall behind. I had worked too hard for this, and I wasn't going to let anything stand in my way. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion. I pushed through, trying to pull everything together, but my body was beginning to betray me. I felt sick all the time, my head pounding, my energy constantly draining, but I had to keep going. I didn't have a choice. Then, on the day that would change everything, I collapsed in the middle of an important meeting. My vision blurred, and my body refused to cooperate. I heard voices, but they seemed so far away. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was Evelyn's voice, sharp and annoyed, asking what was wrong with me. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling the air. The doctors told me I had pushed myself to the brink. My body had simply shut down from the stress. They told me I needed rest, that I should take time off. But I knew what that meant. Taking time off would mean falling behind. It would mean failing. I tried to shake off the weakness, tried to ignore the fact that I was no longer in control of my own body. But when I returned to work, things had already changed. The damage had been done. And that's when I found myself sitting across from Evelyn once again, her eyes cold and indifferent. "Sarah," she began, her voice firm, "we've decided that your recent performance issues are unacceptable. We can't afford to have you on the team any longer. Effective immediately, you're being let go." The words hit me harder than I could have ever imagined. Fired. Just like that. I had given my all, everything I had, and this was my reward. At that moment, everything froze. The world around me seemed to blur as Evelyn's words sank in, each syllable like a dagger. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, to explain, but nothing came out. My mind was a fog of disbelief. "You're fired," Evelyn repeated, as though I hadn't heard her the first time. "Performance issues are one thing, but after what happened last week..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "We just can't afford to keep someone who can't maintain the standards." I felt the walls closing in. I had worked for this company for years. I'd sacrificed everything, my health, my personal life, even my sense of self. And this was how they repaid me? With a cold, dismissive performance issue? It was like everything I had done meant nothing. She handed me a packet, severance papers, I assumed. I don't know if she expected me to sign them immediately or if she thought I'd argue, but I couldn't do either. I was too stunned, too devastated. This wasn't just a job, it was my life. My entire identity had been tied to this place, and now, just like that, it was over. I stood there, my knees wobbling beneath me. "You don't understand," I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. I was sick, I couldn't control it. Her gaze was cold, clinical. "It's not personal, Sarah. It's business." The words echoed in my mind as I left her office. Business. It was always business. That was all they cared about. Profits, performance, numbers, not people. Not the sleepless nights, the stress, the sacrifice. None of it mattered when you couldn't deliver. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. The building seemed different now, distant, unfamiliar. I looked out the glass doors as I stepped into the parking lot, the world outside seeming too bright, too loud. Everything was too much. I could feel the weight of my failure settling on my shoulders, suffocating me. I wasn't just fired, I had been discarded, as though I was nothing more than a cog in the machine. All my effort, my ambition, my dreams of promotion, gone in an instant. I had given everything for this job, and when I needed the company most, it didn't hesitate to throw me away. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry, but I did neither. I didn't know how to feel anymore. I didn't know who I was without that company, without that goal I had been chasing for so long. As I sat on the couch later that evening, the reality of it all began to sink in. I had been abandoned. And worse, I realized, I had let it happen. I had given them everything, and they had taken it all without a second thought. But that night, something shifted inside me. The anger, the frustration, it started to burn. Slowly at first, a spark of rage, but as the hours wore on, it became a fire. I had been wronged, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I wouldn't be their victim. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like the exhausted, broken woman who had been gasping for air in the competitive whirlwind of corporate life. I felt like someone who had been pushed too far, someone who could still fight back. It would take time to figure out how to get back on my feet. But one thing was clear, I wasn't done yet. No one, not even this soulless company, was going to take away my sense of self. Not without a fight. The next day, I began to make calls. I reached out to former colleagues who had left the company, people I had worked with closely, but had lost touch with in the shuffle. People who, like me, had poured their hearts into their work, only to be cast aside when they no longer fit the company's ever-shifting image. I started asking questions, digging into things I had never thought to question before. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized the ugly truth about the company I had sacrificed everything for. There were whispers I had never heard in the halls of the office, whispers about unethical practices, hidden agendas, and dirty deals. The company had been cutting corners, exploiting workers, and making decisions that hurt people, all while pretending to be the ethical leader in the industry. I had spent so long focusing on my career that I had never looked closely enough at the bigger picture. I hadn't realized how many people were suffering because of the company's greed, its disregard for basic human decency. But now I knew, and now I had a plan. I would use everything I had learned, everything I had seen behind the polished walls of that company, to bring them down. I would expose them for the frauds they were. The anger inside me was no longer just about my job or my betrayal. It was about justice. It was about making sure that the company, the people who had discarded me without a second thought, would face the consequences of their actions. I was done playing by their rules. Now, it was time to make my own. The first step was gathering evidence. I started combing through old emails, memos, reports, anything that might expose the company's true nature. I contacted former employees who had been let go under suspicious circumstances, those who had left before they could be fired, and they all had stories to tell. Stories of mistreatment, exploitation, and lies. It wasn't long before I started piecing things together. I had information. I had the ammunition I needed to make them pay for everything they had done to me, and to so many others. I was no longer just Sarah, the ambitious employee trying to climb the corporate ladder. I was someone who had been wronged, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. In the days that followed, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. There was no turning back now. The information I had gathered was damning, but I knew that exposing it wouldn't be easy. The company had deep pockets, and its influence stretched far beyond the walls of the office. They would fight back. They would do everything in their power to protect their reputation. But I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt more alive than I had in months. The moment I decided I was going to take them down, I felt the weight that had been crushing me for so long start to lift. The corporate world might have kicked me out, but I was still in control of my own story. I started by reaching out to a former colleague, Mark. He had left the company under a cloud, much like I had, but he had contacts on the inside. Contacts who, like me, were unhappy with the way the company operated. He had been hinting for years that things weren't as they seemed, but like many, he was too afraid to speak out. Now, though, with the evidence I had gathered, it felt like the right time. "We need to be careful, Sarah," Mark said, his voice tense on the phone. "These people don't play by the rules. They'll come after us if we expose them." I knew he was right. I had seen how they operated. They were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect their profits. But I also knew this: the truth was on our side. We had to fight back. Over the next few weeks, I became more strategic. I reached out to others, former employees who had been let go under shady circumstances, those who had witnessed the company's ethical lapses firsthand. The more I spoke to them, the clearer the picture became. There were stories about the company cutting corners on safety, manipulating financial statements, and pressuring employees to work under unsafe and illegal conditions. There were accounts of harassment that had been swept under the rug, of people who had been intimidated into silence. I had never known the full extent of it, and now it was all laid bare in front of me. But I couldn't just go public with this information. I needed to be smart. I needed to build a case, one step at a time, so that when I did make my move, I could destroy them without mercy. The next piece of the puzzle came when I hacked into the company's internal network, not in a way that was illegal, but just enough to uncover a few key emails that showed how deeply involved the higher-ups were in the unethical practices. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Senior executives were having conversations about covering up illegal activity, using their influence to avoid legal consequences. They had orchestrated a massive campaign to make it look like they were a leader in corporate responsibility, all while lying through their teeth. I knew then that I had them. I had everything I needed to bring them to their knees. But I wasn't going to just leak the information to the press. No, I had a more effective plan. I reached out to a few key journalists, people I had kept in touch with over the years, and started feeding them pieces of the puzzle. They were skeptical at first, but once I started showing them the emails and documents, they understood the gravity of the situation. They were eager to help, but we had to be careful. If we moved too quickly, we risked tipping off the company and giving them time to bury the story before it gained traction. Over the next few weeks, the media began to pick up on the story. Small articles started appearing here and there, whispers about the company's questionable practices. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but I could feel the pressure building. And then came the first big break. A major client, one that the company had relied on for years, started to pull out. The reason? They had received an anonymous tip about the company's unethical practices. They were no longer willing to be associated with a brand that had a tarnished reputation. That one move sent ripples through the corporate world. As the story continued to unfold, more clients followed suit. They backed out one by one until the company was hemorrhaging business. It wasn't just a financial hit, it was a blow to their reputation, one that they couldn't easily recover from. The legal battles began soon after. Journalists, former employees, and even government agencies started poking around, investigating the company's practices. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched. The company's once sterling reputation began to crumble under the weight of the truth. I sat back and watched, my heart pounding with satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. But I wasn't done yet. There was still more to do. I contacted a former lawyer who had once worked for the company, a man named David who had left after becoming disillusioned with their practices. He had connections in the legal world, and together we began to build a case against the company, one that would hold them accountable for the years of corruption. As the company's financials continued to spiral, their top executives were forced to step down, one by one. Whispers of criminal charges began to surface, and the company's stock prices plummeted. The board of directors was scrambling, trying to save what little they could of their empire, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The day the company officially declared bankruptcy, I felt a rush of triumph. It wasn't just the satisfaction of knowing that I had exposed the truth. It was the feeling of reclaiming my life, of taking control of my destiny. For so long, I had been nothing more than a cog in their machine, a tool to be used and discarded. But now, I had taken back the power. And the best part? The workers who had been mistreated, those who had been silenced for so long, were finally speaking out. They were coming forward with their stories, telling the world what had really been happening behind closed doors. They were no longer afraid. I had not only destroyed the company, but I had also become a symbol of resistance, of standing up against a system that cared more about profits than people. And in doing so, I had found my purpose again. The woman who had been discarded, the woman who had been beaten down, had risen from the ashes to become something stronger, something far more powerful. But I wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. The dust settled slowly after the company's collapse, like the remnants of a storm that had torn everything apart. What had once seemed like an unshakable giant was now a crumbling husk. The media frenzy surrounding the scandal didn't die down immediately. In fact, it felt like the whole world was watching, as if everyone knew what had happened, as if I had become part of a much larger narrative. And in some ways I had. But as the company's executives faced legal consequences and their once loyal clients distanced themselves, I found a strange sense of peace in the quiet aftermath. The chaos, the tension, the constant feeling of being on the edge of something terrible, those had all disappeared. What remained was a clear path ahead, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Still, it wasn't just about taking revenge. No, that was only one part of it. The real victory for me came from the fact that I had taken control of my own story. For so long, I had let that company define me. They had dictated my worth, my success, my future. I had poured my soul into a place that had cared so little for me. But I had fought back. I had reclaimed my power, and that was something I would never let go of. The most important realization, though, was that I wasn't done. Not yet. I had been so focused on dismantling the company, on seeing them fall, that I had forgotten about what came next. It had been a whirlwind, and now, as the dust settled, I found myself with no job, no place to go, and, most disturbingly, no clear sense of purpose. But I knew something deep inside. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't long before my phone began to ring with job offers. They came in slowly at first, small companies offering roles that felt too safe, too quiet. I had been at the top of the corporate world, and I knew I was capable of more. I didn't want to settle for a position where I was just another face in the crowd. But then, one day, I received an unexpected call from a company that seemed different. The woman on the other end of the line was named Claire, and she had heard about what had happened with my previous employer. But unlike everyone else who had tried to offer me safe roles, Claire spoke with conviction. "We believe in people, Sarah. We're a company that values dedication, not just the bottom line," she said, her voice warm but confident. "We know you have a lot to offer, and we think you'd be a great fit here. What do you think?" I could tell she meant it, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. A few interviews later, I was offered a role at a growing tech startup, one that focused not only on innovation, but also on employee well-being and corporate responsibility. It felt like a place where I could make a real difference, where my values aligned with the company's mission. They weren't about just making money. They were about making an impact. It felt like the perfect fit. I remember the day I accepted the offer. It was a clear, sunny morning, and as I signed the contract, I realized something. I wasn't just moving on to a new job. I was stepping into a new life, one where I could finally be the person I had always wanted to be, a person who valued her worth, her health, and her happiness. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about living life on my own terms. The transition wasn't easy, starting over at a new company, in a new industry, with a whole new set of challenges. It was a lot, but it felt different this time. I wasn't entering a world where I had to prove myself constantly. This time, I was entering a world that recognized what I had already achieved and was willing to support me in reaching even greater heights. Over time, I found my confidence returning. I rediscovered the passion that had once driven me, but this time, it was fueled by a sense of balance. by a newfound appreciation for my own worth beyond my job. I was no longer defined by the titles I earned or the hours I worked. I was more than that. And as my career began to thrive once again, I found that my story had begun to inspire others, people who had felt just as I had, trapped in toxic corporate systems, giving everything they had only to be discarded when they were no longer useful. They reached out to me, sharing their stories of mistreatment, of being undervalued, of being discarded by the very companies they had worked so hard for. They asked for advice, for guidance. I started speaking out more, at conferences, in interviews, and even on social media. I shared my story openly, and slowly, I began to see a shift. It wasn't just me taking control of my destiny anymore. It was a movement. People were starting to demand better working conditions, better treatment, more humanity in the workplace. And that felt like something truly meaningful. I became known as more than just a woman who had taken down a corporation. I became a symbol of resilience. I became the person who had fought for herself and, in the process, had fought for the people who didn't have a voice. Eventually, I reached a place where I didn't need revenge anymore. I had found something much more powerful: purpose, my own purpose. A purpose that didn't depend on the approval of others, but on my ability to stand tall, to stand up for what I believed in, and to help others do the same. Looking back, I realized that my journey wasn't about the fall of a company or the destruction of a career. It was about rebuilding. It was about starting over with a sense of empowerment and recognizing that, no matter what happens, we all have the power to shape our own future. And that future? Well, it was brighter than I ever could have imagined.